Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is Scrapperlock Rants with American Truck Simulator. We've still got our funds that we're trying to build up to buy our first Western Star truck. Won't be this nice. We're going to be buying the lowest end one, at least to begin. But don't worry, as we hire new drivers, we'll assign the crappy trucks to the new drivers and give the really nice trucks to ourselves. But in the meantime, we're stuck doing quick jobs from the job market. So we're going to do another rant, and we're going to take another quick job in order to do that. So let's see, where haven't we been? We haven't been in Nevada, Idaho, Washington. Let's see, Wyoming. Have we been to Wyoming? Just a little bit. Colorado Springs to Wyoming. We've done some of that already. Let's see. Can we go somewhere different? Everything seems very similar. Texas. Texas, Texas, Texas. Utah to Wyoming? I mean, I guess that's new. It's only 12,000 bucks though. We could earn a lot more money from one of these jobs, I think. We go to the front. Right, 21,000. That's our best bet. Well, that's going through some old and some new territory because we've been through Cheyenne, but we haven't been through Fort Collins and we haven't been to Casper. It's another articulated one, but it's a pretty good price and it's the best price per mile, so let's go ahead and grab it. One of the things you have to watch when you have your own truck and you're getting a job is to make sure that the job has enough time left before it expires. I remember taking one that looked so juicy, and it took me about an hour to get in game time to get to the place, and it had already expired. That doesn't happen with these, however. Oh, now we have one of these really tough articulated guys with the oversized load. By the way, I think that is a one of the mods. So we're going to very carefully maneuver our way, let's see, around, I guess, to get out. And I will start the rant after we do that because this is going to be pretty tight. So we want to make sure that we don't damage the load. By the way, I'm an oversized load. Where's the little chase car that follows the oversized load around and like sort of warns the other drivers with its presence that there's an oversized load ahead and behind? Usually they have like a little car that comes along with it. Do we want to go out this way or the other way? I think we want to go out this way. I think so. It looks like there's an exit here. So we're going to try to push it as wide as we can so that we don't hit anything over there. And then come this way. I used to be much, much worse at this. If you think I'm bad now, you should see the way. Should have seen the way I was when I first played Euro Truck. I was horrible at it, but I'm a little bit better now. So let's see. Looks like we should have gone, I guess, the other way because I thought we were coming out this side here, but we're actually coming out to the right. How the heck do you get out of here? Oh, is it this way? Let's see, maybe it's this way. Oh. Where do we have to go? This way? This is very confusing. I guess we have to come out the fence. Alright, so now we need to make a wide turn that way. And is the fence going to open for us? There it goes. Okay, I guess that's the exit. I was thinking we had to go out. Actually, straight out to the right here, rather than where we're going now. I thought we had to go that way. So I got a little confused there. Yeah, the GPS is sort of like a real GPS in that it can be very frustrating when it's not on the main roads. It doesn't show you where inside the freight yard you have to go. I'm staying way off to the right here and try and pull this load out without scratching it. Looks like that's good. Okay, guys, we've hit the dirt road, and we're on our way. Um, by the way, I do want to point out that we absolutely have new rest endurance at the beginning of each quick job. It always resets it, apparently. And I guess that's because you can kind of teleport all over the map and stuff. When you actually have your own truck, it's just continuous. You can quick travel, but it's otherwise continuous. And so if you just keep doing job after job, at some point you have to stop and rest. And if the jobs get longer than 8 or 10 hours here, you have to stop and rest eventually. Um, and it always rests you for 10 hours, which is, I find, very annoying. But I guess that's some sort of regulation that truckers have to sleep at least 10 hours a day, or have to have a chance to sleep 10 hours a day. Because you can't make them sleep, but they get 10 hours off a day or whatever. So I guess that's why they do it. But I kind of wish, sometimes I wish I could just take like a 2-hour nap or something and restore a little bit of endurance, and then I would be able to, you know, finish a job and then take a 10-hour nap after that. But the game doesn't really allow for that. All right, so time for another rant, and this is once again in response to a great comment from RB on the first episode, not episode 0, but episode 1 of this playlist, where I was talking about letting the dice help you tell the story, and that there isn't an objectively right story until it happens at the table for the players. And RB made some very nice compliments to me about my Ironshorn game, which I actually don't feel was that great, but apparently it sort of opened his eyes a little bit, or her, I don't know, RB's eyes, their eyes a little bit, to the idea of just letting the dice seed a story in your mind and then developing the story from the die rolls and the random tables, rather than always having to plan it out. And then the comment got into something actually very interesting, where RB talked about how players view role-playing games. And I have another friend that I've been talking on Discord with quite a lot. I've referenced him before. We have sort of our own private Discord with a couple of other people. And he is constantly being told by players that he's no fun. I've mentioned him before. He's no fun because he's making them, these really tough challenges, and he's sort of forcing them to really think their way through things, and their challenges are sort of scaled to them, so they just don't feel that powerful. And he's sometimes accused of not being fun or not liking fun, which I don't think is true. I think he has fun from the challenge. And what RB said, which is very on point, and this is what I wanted to talk about today, is that for a lot of players, the game of D&D or Champions or Rollmaster, whatever, the tabletop role-playing game, or any role-playing game, probably computer role-play games too, it's a power fantasy, right? It's not about playing a role so much as it is about power and being powerful. And I think, I hadn't really thought about it that way, but it dovetails perfectly with a comment that I just had in the Savage Worlds unofficial Discord, where somebody was asking how the ranks and the advances work, right? How many advances are you still novice? How many are you seasoned, veteran, heroic, and so on? And so somebody posted, right? 1, 2, 3 is novice, 4, 5, 6, 7 is seasoned, 8, 9, 10, 11 is veteran, 12, 13, 14, 15 is heroic, and 16 to 24, he posted, but you can go above 24, is legendary. And so the person was like, oh, great, so it's sort of like D&D, there are 24 quote-unquote levels, and then he said, so this can support a long campaign, because it was somebody new and he wasn't sure whether Savage Worlds could support a long campaign. And then I don't know, somebody said something like, well, usually, yeah, I mean, if you, a lot of people do an advance every session, you could go 20 or so sessions, give or take. And, oh, he said, that's great. And I said, well, you don't he said, "Oh, good. So it could be a long campaign that lasts 20 or 25 sessions." And I said, "Well, you also don't have to. There's no rule in the book as to when the advances happen. They do say you could do it every session, but they say you could do it every couple sessions. They said you could do it after, achieving milestones for the group. When they at the end of a chapter of a story or what have you. So like with my blood drive group, as they complete each chapter of the published book, I'm giving them an advance. The book doesn't tell you what to do about advances. Apparently, other than Pathfinder for Savage Worlds, which does none of the Savage Worlds books do. They just leave it up to the game master. And I told my group, actually, we were going to do every other chapter, but then the chapters are so long. First chapter was pretty short. It was just like 1 or 2 sessions. But then the second chapter has been super long. And as a consequence, I feel like it's been way too long since they've gotten an advance. They're still not done with the second chapter, and we're like 5 sessions in. And session 1 was the first chapter, and chapter 2 has been 4 sessions. I didn't realize it was going to take that long, and there's at least another session or 2 left of it. So I said, okay, I think we should advance every session rather than every other session, and they agreed. And so, but still, it's going to be, I don't know. There are 9 chapters, so it'll be 9 advances, but it's going to probably take 24 sessions or something. It doesn't have to be every session. And so this person on the Discord said, well, my players like to ding, right? And ding means gain a level. They like to ding, they like to level up. So I definitely want them to level up every session. They like getting powerful, right? And he said something like, I don't know, they don't necessarily need to get more hit points, but they like getting more powers and abilities and more things they can do and more features and blah, 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 right? And so on and so forth. And so, so I think we want to go north here, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. And so I said, well, I actually prefer, unless I'm playing superhero, like actual superheroes, I prefer lower power level and, characters who are a little bit more down to earth. And so then this discussion started of, several people agreed with me, several people agreed with him. And right in the middle of this, I went and checked my YouTube comments to see if there were any, and RB had made this comment saying, I think a lot of players like a power fantasy, and in the other window, I've got this guy who's new to Savage Worlds telling me that his players want a power fantasy, right? They want to level up, they like to ding, they like to get more powerful. And so I thought about this, and I said, I think this actually is a source of friction between a lot of GMs, especially GMs who've been around for a long time and sort of more old school GMs, and players, and especially modern players, current players of role-playing games who've only been into it for the last, say 5, 6, 7 years. That I think the old school players are into it for the role-play a lot. Not all of them, right? There are people who are into it for the power fantasy. But a lot of the old school role-playing games, the older role-playing games, kind of didn't allow you to get all that powerful, or to getting that powerful was brutally hard. And so if you're in it for a power fantasy and you're playing like basic set D&D or AD&D, your wizard's going to be powerful if you get to like 10th or 12th level. But you also have 2 hit points and a 10 armor class at level 1, and you can only cast Read Magic, Write Magic, and Find Familiar, or something like that. And you're probably going to die before you get out of first level or second level, right? You get to second level, you roll d4, you get 1 hit point. Now you have 3 hit points, and maybe you can cast a spell that makes your armor class 9 instead of 10, which is a little bit better. But yeah, a kobold with a kitchen knife can kill you. And so, yeah, if you want a power fantasy, you either have to be really good at delayed gratification, or D&D was not your game years ago. So the people I was playing D&D with weren't playing it for the power fantasy, because you kind of couldn't have one. I don't know if our group ever got above 6th-ish level. And yeah, your characters aren't all that powerful in AD&D by 6th level. They're good, they're solid, they no longer are, made of tissue paper, and they no longer are fighting with, paper plates and plastic kitchen knives as weapons and shields, right? They're actually for real now, but they're not like superhero level Marvel Cinematic Universe, Captain America falling 15 stories and just saying ow and getting up and running. That kind of thing doesn't happen. It happens in Champions a little bit, but it doesn't happen in D&D. And even in Champions, yeah, you could be a superhero and you could be powerful, but relatively speaking, because of the way second edition Champions was designed, it wasn't that easy to be that powerful. You started with 220 points or so most of the time, and if you wanted more than that, you had to take disadvantages, which really could hurt your character, and you just couldn't get everything, and you certainly couldn't be blasting around with 20 die 6 energy blasts. You're lucky if you were doing 9 dice. And so we definitely had people, there's at least one guy in my group who was trying to do the power fantasy, and he was constantly frustrated, by the way, because his attempts to be power gamed, to be overpowered, were frustrated by the balance built into the game system. Back then, it cost an endurance for every 5 active points of power, so he'd put a 70 active point power on his character sheet, and it uses 14 endurance. And to reduce the endurance cost, it wasn't a plus a quarter advantage, it cost a quarter of the points, which is more. So it was going to cost, 18, 17 points to reduce the endurance to 7 endurance per phase. Now that's the way it is by default now, 1 per 10, but it used to be 1 per 5, and that made it very expensive to try and deal with. This is why the guy that I was talking about where he was cheating on his endurance, this is why he's cheating on his endurance, right? Because it was so expensive to run your powers that, you would run if you had that much power, you would run out of endurance. Even if you had 60 endurance, which was a lot, you'd run out of endurance after 3 phases, right? It's phase 8, segment 8 or 9, and you're out of endurance, and you have to turn your force field off and stop flying. So it was really hard to have a power fantasy in a game like that that's balanced, in a sense, to prevent you from being overpowered. And D&D was sort of the same way. Wizards eventually become wildly overpowered and can cast things like Wish, but that's at like 14th level and stuff. And who lives that long? Yes, there were a few people, but the overwhelming majority of people who played D&D never got into the double digits, and the wizards in particular almost never lived that long, right? The magic users who could live that long were often like the elven or half-elven fighter magic users, and those guys had a level limit where they couldn't go over a certain level just because they were elves and because they were multi-classed. And they were dividing their experience between 2 classes, so when the party is 8th level, your character is 4-3. 4th fighter, 3rd magic user, and you're still casting 2nd level spells, which isn't even Fireball, let alone Wish. And so I think in the old days it was harder to have that power fantasy, and so the players weren't generally looking for it. Some were, but it wasn't most. It was the odd guy in each game group was on a power fantasy and was being frustrated by the fact that the game wouldn't let him, and then had to cheat to be on that power fantasy. Like this guy who played the Bad Rob, who played Champions with us, and the game masters were advised by the rule books, essentially, not to allow the power fantasy, right? That power fantasies are, like power gaming and being overpowered and stuff is a bad thing, and you should do things, take measures to prevent your players from doing that. I read in one of my rants for the Stalker, I believe, I read out Gary Gygax's advice at the beginning of the Dungeon Master's Guide, where he talks about how players are always going to want to get more powerful, and the GM has to resist the temptation to allow it because it's going to break the game. And so what he's advising you there is don't let the players on power fantasies get their power fantasy, because if you do, it could break the game. But it's not broken to the player on the power fantasy, because what they want to do is lord their power over the world, and they don't care that the game is easy or boring, because the power fantasy is, that's sort of what they want, right? And so then the question becomes, a lot of the modern players who came into it through computer role-playing games where you can get mods that take restrictions off the game, and you can play it on easy mode if you want, and really have your power fantasy where you're just blowing everything up and destroying everything, those players come to the D&D table or the Savage Worlds table or the Dark Master table or the Stars Without Number table wanting the power trip, wanting the power fantasy. And if you're a game master, I mean, a lot of game masters who are like, a lot of the experienced players, this is my sense, have become the game masters, right? The new players join the group, but the GM is still somebody who's experienced, right? It's often not the new person, although it might be somebody new if the whole group is new, right? And so they're there trying to give a challenging, balanced experience, and they've got a bunch of players who just want the power fantasy, right? They just want to be powerful. Now, again, if the whole group wants the power fantasy and the GM wants to play into that, then that's fine. And a lot of Champions games today are like that because 5th edition and 6th edition Champion, well, I don't know about 6, but 5th edition Champion is definitely about the power fantasy, where they, sort of took some of the restrictions off, or basically as the editions went forward, they made it easier and easier and easier to make more and more powerful characters that were still game legal and fit within like 250 starting points. And of course you could also have 375 starting point level and that sort of thing, which some players like my best friend will argue for. Again, this is somebody who wants to be powerful. Now my best friend would say, yes, it's a superhero game, we should be powerful, we shouldn't feel as weak as an Elven Fighter Magic user does in D&D, and maybe there's a point to that. But for a non-superhero game, right, for a non-superhero game, having that power fantasy could potentially break the game, depending on how the game is written. And it might break it for the group if some people in the group are like me and don't want to be uber powered, and some people do, right? I mean, we had the Bad Rob, who was the only one on a power fantasy, and the game was rough for him because the rest of us weren't on the power fantasy and didn't want to allow him to be. And that's where there was this constant, he was cheating, and there was a lot of fighting and a lot of, not fighting isn't the right, arguing, right? And a lot of stress in the group because you had one player trying to live out a power fantasy and the other players trying to say, no, 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 we have to have a balanced game where everything is reasonable, right? And where it all makes sense. And so I think the main difficulty occurs when you have a mismatch. Either the GM wants a realistic, gritty game and the players all want power fantasy. That's hard. But if the GM realizes it and is willing to run the power fantasy, it's not so bad. I think one of the problems my friend on the Discord channel has is that he recognizes it, but he is not willing to run a power fantasy game. And as a consequence, he gets very frustrated when his players are trying to do the power fantasy. They accuse him of hating fun because to them, fun and the power fantasy are synonymous. The power fantasy is the fun, right? So I think that, I mean, if you have a mismatch and the GM and the players aren't willing to be flexible about whether you're on a power fantasy or not, you could have an issue. But I think the biggest issue comes, in my experience, when you have players who feel differently. You have a group of 5 people and 2 people want a power fantasy game and 3 people want a verisimilitude realistic game. And now you have a problem because the GM kind of can't provide both. If he allows the 2 people who want the power fantasy to have it, those characters will then like overshadow all of the normal, gritty, regular characters that the other 3 players have. And then those players may not be on a power fantasy, but they don't necessarily want to be overshadowed by these 2 guys who are being allowed to, basically run rampant in the world while they have to just sit back and watch these 2 guys be like the hero all the time and that sort of thing. And so what you have to watch out for is how many people in the group are desiring a power fantasy and how many people in the group aren't. If nobody in the group is, you're good. If everybody is, you're probably good, right? I mean, I would look at the game you're running and go, man, that's broken, and I wouldn't want to play in it. But if you and your players are enjoying the power fantasy and nobody minds it, you're fine. But the real problem comes when you have some people who want the power fantasy game, and some people who want a realistic game that's not a power fantasy but is a challenge and is really hard to overcome. And as a consequence, then you can have this mismatch that means that somebody or several somebodies are going to be unhappy. And this is what happened in my group, right? We had one guy on a power fantasy and the rest of the group not really on a power fantasy, and it led to a lot of friction and a lot of arguments, and it led to him leaving the group. Right now, again, we were kids. I think he left when he was in 9th grade. We were in 10th. He started playing us when he was with us when he was in 7th, and we were in 8th. And we were all going to the same junior high. And then for high school, he went to a private Catholic school, and we went to the public school. And so we stopped seeing him in school, like in the cafeteria and stuff, first. And he continued to play with us for a while. Actually, I don't think he went to the private high school yet. He was still in 8th grade when we were in 9th grade, and we still played with him then. But then when he went to the private high school, we saw even less of him, and because then they had different holidays and stuff, and eventually we drifted apart. But one of the reasons that we didn't make a very severe effort to maintain contact with this guy is because he was trying to play the game differently from the rest of the group. He was trying to have a power fantasy, while the rest of us were trying to have a realistic experience and be challenged. Now, we didn't articulate it that way when we were, kids, because we weren't sophisticated enough to do that, but that's clearly what was happening to my group. So, I think a lot of players today are playing D&D and Savage Worlds and some of these other games for the power fantasy. And as a game master, if you have a group that's doing that, you have to make a decision, right? Do I want to allow the power fantasy and play into that and give the players what they're asking for? Will they actually like it? I mean, that's part of the problem, right? Is that some people ask for the power fantasy not realizing what it means, how easy it's going to make the game, right? And after a few sessions, they get bored and they want to know, why are we bored? Well, it's because the GM's letting you have your power fantasy and you're just beating everything up because you're so powerful, right? So that might be one of these, be careful what you wish for, you might get it types of deals. But maybe not, and maybe the players will like it, and if you're willing to run a game like that, that's fine. But you have to be careful. Make sure that your other players, do want the power fantasy. It's not just a couple. And make sure you're happy. Make sure you're happy running that type of a game, because, for instance, I wouldn't be, right? So if my group is right now, we're having a conversation. There are so many different settings in Savage Worlds and other games I want to play, and we're playing this long Deadlands campaign, which is great. I don't want to stop it, but we only play every 2 weeks for 3 hours, and probably once every couple months somebody cancels. So if we're lucky in a 12-week period, we play maybe 5 times. And so it's not enough for me, and I would like a little more, but I would like that little more with this existing group of friends. So I proposed to them that we might want to start a second campaign that I'm willing to run, play by post, right? And I've proposed a few possible settings: East Texas University, Holler, Harn World with Savage Worlds as the game mechanics rather than Harn Master, Call of Cthulhu, and Delta Green. Now, a lot of these are definitely not power fantasies for the players. There's normal people fighting a very horrific world in ETU and Delta Green and Call of Cthulhu. In Holler, your characters sort of start out like more underpowered than normal for Savage Worlds, because you don't get the type of gear, access to the type of gear that most characters get, and so that makes it harder. And then Harn, Savage Harn, I would be using some setting rules that make it rather difficult and increasingly challenging. So all of these are rough settings, and they're definitely not meant for people to be on a power fantasy. So when we have our session 0, one of the things that we have to discuss is, are you looking for a power fantasy? If you are, I may not be the GM for you in this play-by-post, because I'm not interested in running a game where I'm allowing the players to be on a power fantasy. Is this guy going to hit me? Okay. So, yeah, that's something to talk about early on in session 0. Um, I've explained all the possible settings to these guys. Hopefully it's clear to them that, I mean, heck, in some of them you don't even get like an arcane background or any magic powers, and it was very clear that magic is rare and it's powerful but rare and hard to come by in Harn World, and in Holler you can't easily get gear. So I was very clear to them that death is on the table in all of these settings, as well as insanity in some of these settings, and basically you're pretty darn close to a normal person in a normal and dangerous world, and then there's some supernatural elements to it. In most of these settings, although there's a lot more supernatural in the Holler, and you know, if they don't like any of that, and they're like, we want to be more like Marvel Cinematic Universe, super powered like D&D characters from 5th edition, then I'm going to say, somebody else want to run it, or maybe we don't do it. Or maybe a few of you aren't going to be in it, because I am not going to run a power fantasy game. I don't find that interesting as a player or as a game master. Like, if you're overpowered, what significance is there to the victory? Right? The victory is significant when you're underpowered, or at least even powered for the encounter or the challenge, so that you have to use your noggin at least a little bit, and you have to use your skill as a player, and as well as the character's abilities, to scrape through a victory. One of the reasons why I often say that the good Rob was the best game master, and I loved how he ran Champions, is that most of his battles were super tough. He would playtest his battles over and over again until he got them tweaked to a challenge level that he thought was good. And that challenge level was basically to leave the battle ending when on the victor's side, one guy was left standing with a handful of stun left, and on the defeated side, everybody's down. So you've got 5 heroes and 5 villains. There's 10 guys on the field. At the end of that battle, there should be one guy standing, one hero, and that hero shouldn't have very many stun left. And he very often got very close to that ideal. His battles were insanely challenging, and I loved them, because you couldn't have a power fantasy in his game. His villains always seemed like they were more powerful than the heroes. Often they were individually, and we would have to like gang up on them to defeat them. But I really appreciated that level of challenge, and that's why he's my favorite game master pretty much of all time. And so I like a challenge, even in a power fantasy game like Champions. And so I would not be inclined, and I would probably be ill-suited to running a game of pure power fantasy. So I'm not going to run something like that, and I don't want to play in something like that. And by the way, this friend of mine in the Discord is the same way. He imposes all of these, what should we call it? Custom voluntary penalties on himself. So he's playing a wizard, and he said, I'm not going to take in D&D 5th edition, and most editions, wizards have to find spells in spell books or scrolls and use write magic or whatever to copy the spells into their spell book, and it costs a certain amount of gold. And in low levels, it's extremely expensive, and you really almost can't afford it. And then as you get to higher levels, it becomes sort of trivial. And he and I have talked about that, and he said, yeah, they should make it more expensive at high levels. I like the idea, he said, of the fact that I've got 3 spells I could potentially copy into my spell book, but I can only afford to copy one of them, and I have to figure out which one. Most players would hate that, because that doesn't play into a power fantasy. But he and I think that's kind of cool and interesting. And also in 5th edition, they say that the wizard can automatically get into their spellbook at each level 2 free spells. And he said, what's the in-character mechanic for that? They just suddenly appear in my spellbook for free? He said, no. So he went to the GM and he said, I'm not going to do that. What he said to the GM is, could you please put a couple of extra scrolls into the treasure each level that could be the wizard scrolls, that could be the scrolls that I'm copying into my book, but I still want to pay the gold that it takes to copy. So he was walking around with, I don't know, by 5th level, he was walking around like half a dozen scrolls from lower level spells that he still hadn't copied into his book because he didn't have enough gold to do it. He loved that. But that's not a power fantasy, right? He loved it because it was realistic. He loved it because it was a challenge. His character had to like sell some magic item that would have been, moderately useful, so that just to have enough gold to have enough money to buy the supplies and the paper and the magical ink that you need to copy the spells into the spell book. And so this is someone who's enjoying the gritty realism rather than the power fantasy. And I hate to say this because I don't like the fact that it's true, but I think it is true that it's very, very hard to have both types of players in the same campaign successfully, because although you can do a lot with helping different types of players enjoy your campaign, right, there are lots of ways that you could do that. Hopefully this guy won't hit me. So a lot of times they stop for you and then they hit you anyway. They like start up and just crash into you. There are lots of ways that you can compromise as players so that you can play with each other in very many different elements of the game. But it's extremely difficult to find a way to run a game that both makes the people on a power fantasy happy and makes the people who want the gritty realism happy. Because one thing they're sort of mutually exclusive, right? One thing kind of excludes the other. And if you allow, say, one player to be on the power trip and not the other players, then the player who's on the power trip is essentially being given an advantage over the players who aren't, and that can seem very unfair. And then it's also not removing the power trip element from the game. It's just removing it from some of the players who don't like it, but they still have to sit through the guy on the power fantasy having the power fantasy, and if you don't like that, you're not going to enjoy that either. I think it can be very difficult to moderate this, and in many cases it simply may be that what needs to happen is what happened to my group, which is that the person on the power trip had to be excised from the group, or if everybody's on a power trip from but one, the person who likes the gritty realism might have to be excised from the group. And by the way, that happened to this same guy who's in the Discord with me. He was asked to leave his D&D group because every time they did power trip stuff, he would say to them, no, this isn't how it works. And they're like, oh, rule of cool. He's like, no, it's not. The rule's not supposed to work this way. Right? And after he argued with them, and I don't even think he was arguing with them about anything happening in their game. I think he was arguing with them about a story that the one player told about how they had come across some sort of a powerful wyvern or dragon, and they didn't have enough resources to fight it, but the cleric cast create food and water and created water inside the wyvern's mouth, and his head exploded. And like that's explicitly in the rule book. It says you can't do that. Right? You can't do it inside of another character. And when this guy pointed out it's explicitly against the rules, he was kicked out of his group. You're just not any fun. Right? What that means is we want to be on a power fantasy and you don't. And so let's start doing some hazardous stuff. No, actually, let's do the high value. Should get us a little bit more value to our cargo. So yeah, I mean, unfortunately, when it comes to power fantasy versus not, it's very, very hard to have a group that's got some of each and that it's happy. And what I've seen is when you have a group that's all realistic verisimilitude people and one person on a power fantasy, that guy ends up leaving. And this other group that I know about where everybody's on a power fantasy except the one realism guy, he ended up leaving, right? This is the same guy that was not learning all the free wizard spells because he thought having free spells was too easy and didn't make any in-character sense, right? It wasn't realistic. And so he's giving up power. Same thing with me. I'll just tell this story very quickly, and then we'll stop. I'm not sure if I actually posted this, but I was talking about having a Way of the Open Hand monk who's sort of like been taught by essentially a Mr. Miyagi type character, where monk powers are only for defense, not for attack. He's not going to sneak attack. He's not going to get the flanking bonuses and things like that. And yeah, that's me not being on a power fantasy is actually nerfing my own character because it's realistic and because it's in character, and it makes it more of a challenge. And so it can be very difficult to have players who are on the power fantasy and players who aren't playing happily together side by side. That can be a huge challenge. And I don't have any real answers for that, except that it's probably the case that those two groups of players need to part ways or find a game where that kind of thing perhaps doesn't matter so much, like Ironsworn, where you kind of can't be on a power fantasy, although the people on the power fantasy probably wouldn't like that. So, I don't know. Let me know what comments you have about this, what experiences you've had with whether you've been on power fantasies. Are you the type of person who plays D&D for a power fantasy? It's not wrong, it's just not the way I play. Or are you the type of person who plays a game like D&D or Savage Worlds for the realism and the simulationism of it? There's just different ways to play. It's just important to know which way you are and to have an agreement as a group which way you're going to play. And if somebody just can't play the way the rest of you want to play, you might have to have a conversation about that too. So anyway, where are we? We have $98,000. We only need about 25,000 left to purchase our first truck, and then we'll be able to do things like start upgrading it and hopefully get some slightly better and more profitable jobs as we go along. That's it for this episode. Until next time, I am Scrapperlock, and this has been Scrapperlock Rants with American Truck Simulator.